Victor, welcome.
Thank you for having me, you guys.
So I have a couple questions because I want a little bit of a history perspective.
Yeah.
I'm doing as you may not know, but I'm going off to seminary next fall.
Yeah.
I'm going
Oh,
to
wow.
become yeah. So I'm doing a lot of reading, and I'm doing a lot of like Old Testament Hebrew Bible
Yeah.
reading,
Yes.
and kind of and like and it and there's a point at which there's a point at which it just feels very Bronze Age, and then there's a point
Yes.
when suddenly it's Greek and
Yes.
Alexander and Roman, and
Yes.
they have been fighting. These empires have been fighting in that land forever, it seems like.
Yes. Well, it becomes part of the Holy Land, so to speak. What is now Jordan, the West Bank, Gaza, and Israel becomes part of the so-called West in about 331 when Alexander wins the Battle of Issus, and then he absorbs what was the decaying Persian Empire. And in that empire is Judea and the Jews. And he and his successors, the Seleucids, and leave them alone. And then that empire is absorbed by Rome. Part of it, the Attalids give it to Rome in the 2nd century AD, but by the 1st century BC, the 1st century BC, that comes under Roman domination.
Right.
And then you have Herod the Great, who's a client king. And everything seems to be working well until the Romans decide that they can't give any more exemptions to the Jews who won't honor the emperor, because now
Right.
they've transitioned as a deity. So then we have the Vespasian and Titus destroy Jerusalem, and that starts the beginning of the diaspora. But there'll be a number of revolts after that as well.
Well,
But that's when Greek and Latin start to become part of the exegesis of not only the Old Testament but the New Testament. The New Testament will be written somewhere around 45 to 90 A.D.
And there are two moments in the Hebrew Bible, I guess, or the Tanakh. They always have a new name for it, Tanakh. That are kind of chilling. One is Alexander zips through Judea on his way to Gaza, and they eat. There's no mention of like any. I think it's Herodotus. There's no mention of the Jews. They don't show up. They're not. But to read it and to see these names.
Yeah, I know.
Like,
I think it's
crazy.
Because they're Persian subjects, and they're not. They've been given certain exemptions under the Persian Empire, and they're not sure what his siege of. They don't know what's going to when he besieges Tyre and Gaza. He doesn't know who's going to win. And he's only 23 at this point. So a lot of people, not just the Jews, but a lot of people are just waiting to see if he's really going to destroy the Persian Empire. And then they'll cut a deal with him. But they don't want to go out on a limb and join him and then find out he's going to lose.
Well, wise. And there's another kind of creepy or I shouldn't say creepy moment, but like thrilling moment really in the movie where you know how it ends. And I think it's in Second Maccabees or something. And it's a part of the sort of political assessment. And they're saying, look, everybody's so crappy to us here, the Persians and the Greeks. There's a new empire over there, a little farther west in Rome. Why don't we see if they'll come and help us get independent? And when you're reading it, it's like you're in a movie and you want to say, no, that's not going to be good either. That's not a solution either.
No.
But it's both thrilling and depressing to think that people have been arguing over this 11-mile wide, in some places, piece of land for thousands of years. And we thought we had a solution. I mean,
it's very ironic. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's ironic when I walk across the Stanford campus and hear all of these people saying, from the river to the sea, and they're settlers and they're interlopers about the Jews. And we got to remember that the Jews were they began to spread after the destruction of the Second Temple and the city of Jerusalem, but there was still a large population of Jews, and we had the Maccabee revolutions, etc. But when the empire fell in the West, that became part of the Byzantine Empire, and the
Right.
Byzantines allowed the Jews to stay there, and they had pretty good relations until the mid 600s when Islam came in and took the Holy Land. So we're talking about, I think you could argue that there's evidence of Jewish civilization with a written language as early as 13 or 1400 BC. Some evidence. So then you're talking about 2,000 years before Islam even came to the Holy Land. And so who was there? It was the Jews who were there. And there were Jewish settlements, not a lot, but that were continuous all the time. People, families that lived there all the way up until modern time. But it's a very strange thing about radical Islam is that once radical Islam goes into an area, they claim it as its ancestral homeland. They do that with Spain. That was one of the big talking points of Osama bin Laden. Al-Andalus, this was ours. No, it wasn't. You came in the 7th century and tried to steal it. And then you occupied it for 400, 500 years, but you were always at war with Iberians. And the same thing is true of the Holy Land. The same thing is true of North Africa. It was Punic. Actually, it was indigenous Berbers, and then the Punic under the Carthaginians came in the 8th century, and then they were wiped out by the Romans, and then the Romans from essentially 146 all the way into the 450s. And then the Byzantines recaptured it, and the Vandals took it, and then they recaptured it from the Vandals and held it for almost 150 years. And then the Islam was the last, those were the last arrivals on the scene. And yet when you talk to people, I've been to all of those Middle East countries in North Africa, when yet you talk to people, they think it's been Islamic from the beginning of time.
Yeah.
And it's really weird. It's a very weird mindset when you talk to people like that.
I know Steve wants to jump in. I was in Tunis a few years ago, and hiking around Carthage, and it's, first of all, it's amazing to think that all we're looking at is about 10% of what's there. That there's more underneath all those neighborhoods and houses that have been built over the years, and then they show you the Carthaginian sort of naval yard.
Yes,
this is a big circle, big round thing, and it's kind of like, this is wrong. This is absolutely the wrong interpretation. But my interpretation was like, this is kind of small. Like the Romans were afraid of these guys. Like like a local, like a local dock. It's not that big.
Well, part of the problem was that the city actually reached its highest population right before it was destroyed, about 550, 600,000 people. And Scipio, the philosopher, supposedly, with Polybius at his side, destroyed that city. I mean, we have a description in Appian, very graphic. They destroyed it block by block. They didn't sow salt in the ground. That was a medieval add-on. But they leveled it, and then they prohibited anybody from settling it. And then the Gracchi tried to bring in some left-wing people and make kind of a utopian veterans communal city, and that just failed. And then for 100 years, it was just desolate. And then when Caesar came, he created something called Carthago Nova, and that was the new city of Carthage. And it was not quite on the same side of the rubble. It was near it. And that harbor you're seeing is the Roman rebuilding of what was wiped out as the Carthaginian. So there's almost none of the old Carthaginian Punic city, but the remains today are the Roman city. And the Roman city, my gosh, I think by the 1st century AD, it was the fourth largest city in the empire after Rome and Constantinople and Antioch.
Victor, it's Steve Hayward.
I
out in
see.
well, first of all, I think Rob did this too quickly. You know things are bad when Rob Long is going off to seminary.
Yeah.
He's like Augustine going to Hippio Regus as the Vandals are outside the city.
You figured it out. Yeah, exactly right. See you, fellas.
Yeah, and the irony is I'm today in San Francisco, believe it or not,
wow.
speaking at a panel on climate change, and it's freezing cold here. It's so it couldn't be any more perfect, right? It's colder than even it is usually here. But look, Rob going off to seminary, I saw the title of your new book, "The End of Everything: How Wars Descend into Annihilation," and I thought, Victor's taken a cheerful turn for a change. Look, there's great history here, but I think there's also parable, which I think is your intention, or at least that's what I've taken away from it. The subtext, and it's not very much sub, is that America is not immune from the peril of thinking that things can happen quickly, that we are led by gullible and ignorant leaders. I think back to Lincoln's Lyceum address, which, I know he said, look, we have these two big moats around America. This is 1838, right? And so nobody can really invade us and take us down. It's too hard. If we're going to fall, we'll be the authors of our own destruction. And I still think there's a lot that's true. And maybe it connects to what you're after here. But you point out that a lot of people have made a similar mistake over the years in thinking either they're immune, that allies will come rescue them. I've done a whole bullet point list of some of your observations. Give us a scenario or two. This goes beyond the four corners of your book a little bit, this question, but give us a scenario or two of what you think are our largest vulnerabilities that our leaders are oblivious to or not taking seriously.
Well, in the book, all of these societies had long pedigrees. They all had very impressive fortifications. They had large empires. They all thought they were invulnerable, and they had no idea of the temperament of an Alexander the Great or Scipio or Mehmet, or especially Hernan Cortez. And they all thought, as you said, and I pointed out, that the allies would save them or they could negotiate and they all knew that complete annihilation was very rare in war. But when I looked at the present world, and I looked at all the people who have been leveling existential threats. I mean, existential by saying, we want to wipe you off the face of the earth. That's Kim Jong-un. I was surprised at Erdogan. He has threatened to send missiles into Athens. He's threatened to send them into Nicosia. He said about Nagorno, the corridor that they just ethnically cleansed 150,000 Armenians. He said this was the solution our grandfathers used and we'll use it again. He's threatened to wipe out the Kurds. We've had Putin. I think I counted 17 news accounts of Russian media, Putin saying they would use nuclear weapons if they felt it was necessary in Ukraine. And then China issued a video, remember, about having to wipe out Japan if it intervened Taiwan. And then I looked at the reaction. Everybody said, this is crazy. They never do this. And this isn't even Iran, when Mr. Rafsanjani said 20 years ago that Israel was a one-bomb state. So there's a pattern here. And when I look at the United States, it kind of unfortunately falls into the pattern. One of them is financial insolvency. All of these cities did not have the wherewithal that they thought they had. So we look at the United States, we are borrowing $1 trillion every 90 days. And what's funny about that is there's no one on either side that has a plan. I mean, I thought at some point somebody would say, well, Alan Simpson and Bowles had a plan, a very simplified tax code, which had we adopted when Obama formed the commission in 2009, we would be balanced budget and we would have half the debt paid off. But no one's talking about that. And yet the interest on the debt, as Neil Ferguson pointed out not too long ago in an article, is larger than our defense budget. And the interest rate is 5.5%. So it's about 13 or 14% of the entire budget. So that is hampering us. When Trump says he's going to rebuild the military and up it back to 4 or 5% GDP, you want to know where he's going to get the money. And that the only way you can get the money is to cut. The second thing is the borders have collapsed. All these societies could not enforce their borders for a variety of reasons, but our border is not porous. It doesn't exist. They don't believe in borders. They feel that they're constructs, and then this globalized mindset, everybody has an inbred natural right to go wherever he wants. That's the charitable view. That the uncharitable is that this is what they call the new democratic majority, or demography is destiny, to quote some of the books that they write. But we don't know what 10 million people are doing in this country. And we'll never, I think it will take 20 years if you had conservative administrations to fix this. And by fixing, I mean find out all the 10 million people are here, give them background checks, deport the bad people, give some process to get a green card. It's a total mess, and it was by intent. And then, of course, something is deadly wrong with our military, and that's something that happened in these case studies that I showed. We have 45,000 people who did not recruit. They were not recruited. The Pentagon says, well, it's because the job market is tight, or people are obese, or they're in gangs, or they're not. But they've lowered the standards, and they still can't get them. But when you actually don't listen to the Pentagon, but you go online and very carefully, it's very hard to do, but a couple of us have looked at it. They do have demographies of the people who are not joining. Latinos are joining, blacks are joining, women are joining, everybody but you know who, white males. White males are not joining the military. And when you look at the fatality rates in Afghanistan and Iraq, they died at roughly 75 and 74%, twice their numbers in the demography. So basically the military, when Milley went on congressional testimony with Austin and Gilgad, or whatever his name was, Chief of Naval Operations in 21, and they said that they were going to hunt out white rage. They were going to read Professor Kendi's book. And then they bounced out 8,500 people who most of them had natural immunity, and they said they weren't vaxxed. They sent a message that these people were not wanted, or that if they wanted to be promoted or retained, there were going to be DEI standards. And they just said, fine, I don't want to do it, especially after Afghanistan, that humiliation. And so now we don't have the people that we send that volunteer to go to god-awful places like Helmand Province or Fallujah.
Right. The condition of the military, the morale is bad, I hear from people, is giving me flashbacks. And I'm not sure whether to invoke the old Santa Ana, people who don't remember the past are doomed to repeat it, or Marx's line that history repeats, first as tragedy and then as farce. But I'm having flashbacks to the Carter years, when you had a lot of the same thing happening. Very low morale. Inflation had put so many soldiers below the poverty line. Things didn't work. Desert won. I thought it was not possible to exceed the gullibility and ignorance of the Carter administration. But right now, I would take Zbigniew Brzezinski and Cy Vance back in a heartbeat compared to our current leadership, which seems to me an order of magnitude worse than the Carter people were.
Yes. I'm glad you brought that up. I wrote an article, but I didn't realize, and you're the Reagan historian, I didn't realize when I went back and spent about 4 or 5 days reviewing that campaign, how close that race was.
Yes.
In June and right about now. I mean, I think the polls were slanted, but Reagan was either a point back or 3 points up, or it went back and forth. Right. And he really didn't break that open until, wasn't there a poll, Stephen, like 10 days before by Gallup that had Carter even ahead?
Yes.
I think,
that's right. Yes.
And I think it's very similar, because we hear that Trump is ahead he's making historic inroads with youth, with Latinos, blacks, even Asians are coming back. But when you look at the national polls, Fox had Biden ahead. So either that inroad is only in these swing states, and then the California population in New York makes up for it on the national level, or they're not accurate. And it reminds me so much of Reagan. And what they said about Trump and Reagan were eerie. Yep. That Reagan had he had never been a federally elected official, that he was going to blow up the world. George W. Bush had called him voodoo economics, and he was too old, and Carter was going to slice him up in the debate. It was very reminiscent. So that gave me a little bit of hope that this election, if they keep doing what they're doing. And Carter was pandering in the same way. I mean, Biden, when he sells out Israel for a few thousand votes in Michigan, or he drains the strategic petroleum, or this latest amnesty, or the tariffs, or working with Obrador now to send people away from the border, or the student loan forgiveness. He thinks that he can patch up all of these little slivers of, pandering, and they're going to make a majority. I don't think it's going to work. I don't think people like what he's doing. But so I think it could break. I think it could be broken open. I think if Trump is careful and gets, I don't know, that's a broken record. But if he doesn't, if he doesn't go after and call people,
right.
He said about Paul Ryan the other day. I started laughing. He said, "Get that dog off of." I mean, if he hadn't said the word dog, it might have been more effective.
Right.
But
right.
He could blow this thing apart. He really could.
It does feel like a change election, right? It does feel like that's what
I think
big,
it does.
Fat change election.
I do.
Because there's just so much. It just feels like there's so much powder in the keg here. It's just going to have to go. And I think we're looking at the rest of the world. Go ahead. So yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I would imagine within 2 to 3 weeks, Israel will feel that it's pretty much decimated Hamas. And then when we get into late July or August, it's going to do something about Hezbollah. And that's going to be a big, nasty war. And that's going to put a lot of pressure. Part of the subtext of what Netanyahu's video was about is that they're not giving them the actual JDAM adapted, all of that stuff that's necessary to stock up for Hezbollah. And that's going to be right during the election. And I think if Biden comes out, I mean, Hezbollah doesn't get the kind of romance that the Palestinians do. It gets some.
Yeah.
But it's very hard for a young, stupid, useful idiot on, say, Berkeley campus to start waving Hezbollah flags. It's easier with Hamas. And so I think that if he sells Israel down the road and they get into an existential war with Hezbollah and you get major damage to Haifa and stuff, it's going to really hurt him.